Hey everybody, this is another installment of Baker's Backyard or Baker's Corner. We're going to actually focus our lessons this week on the idea of America's first industrial revolution. And this is actually a really cool concept or set of concepts. Why? Because a lot of you that have studied world history, you probably remember talking about industrial revolutions, how Britain was a really leading member, kind of like in the forefront of this. And America is really going to benefit from a lot of that influence and also a lot of its own personal development. So we're going to be looking at basically a period of time that lapses over about a 50-year period of time from about the 1790s up until around the 1840s. Okay. And so this is going to be a part of our study for this week that focuses more on economic kinds of thinking and also concepts, but there are going to be some links to things like politics, right? Why would people want to invest in building things like roads and canals and bridges and railroads and all these different things that are obviously going to enhance our economy? So guess what? Let's get started. What do we want to be able to master by the end of today's lesson? We'll be doing another one on day 2 that will focus on things like the development of a market revolution and how this idea, guys, of the market revolution and internal improvements and all that leads to further sectional tension between places like New England, the Midwest, and also, of course, the South. Okay, so our objectives, we want to be able to do 3 things, of which 3 we will build upon with our next lesson. So we want to be able to identify and explain how new technology, enhanced transportation, in other words, improvements, and elements of capitalism contributed to the first industrial revolution. Okay. And so let's think about the difference between identify and explain. Identify is going to be list, here's a form of technology, and explain is going to be taking it to that next level. Okay, we know we have a cotton gin, we know we have a mechanical reaper, we know we have a steamboat. Now, okay, whoop-de-doo. What do all these things help us to be able to do that is going to put us in a better position to have a national economy and develop things like trade, okay? And also, obviously, develop division within parts of the nation. 2, identify the rise of manufacturing and how this impacted the development of the market revolution within the United States. So we're going to be building upon that objective a lot over the course of the next few days. And then thirdly, we want to be able to define the term internal improvements. Okay? A lot of you have heard, oh, we have a road, we have a highway, we have a road that connects a road, right? A bypass or whatever. Okay? We have a railroad that goes smack dab through parts of Wake Forest, North Carolina, which is where I live at. Okay? Okay, what does that do that helps the economy develop? Later on, that would be building things like airports, okay? Connections for internet traffic. But of course, we know we're not there yet, right? But think your noggin, guys. Think about modern times too. Okay, so you might want to pause this if you're not in class today, and I'm going to ask you guys to really just focus on the number 1 brainstorm activity here, and that is list as many things as you can that come to mind when you hear the term industrial revolution. Pause your screen, take a minute to reflect, and then unpause, and we'll go over a couple of things that might stand out. Did you have the opportunity to do that? What kinds of things did you jot down? Now, you could do anything from the 1790s and the 1800s. You could do something that kind of defines our economy moving into the early 1900s, or modern days, as in for you and I now, 2020. There's not a right or wrong to this. The one thing we're trying to get you to do is, of course, think about what you associate with the word industrial and revolution. Well, keep in mind, change is significant with revolution. What is changing? When we think of industry, you may have written down something along the lines of factories producing things, all right? New forms of technology that's going to have a dramatic effect on not just the economy, but also the daily lives of people. I mean, think about it like this, just a quick tidbit on this. You and I would not be able to have a class like this the same way that we're thinking of it in 2020 if this kind of thing had happened back when I was 16 years old in the year 1991. Okay? So what does that say? It opens up doors of opportunity economically, socially, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? What kinds of new technology are we obviously going to see beyond that? You know, kinds of automobiles as we enter more of the early 1900s. How's that going to affect the economy? Okay? That's what we're trying to get you to think about. But what about the 1790s to about the 1840s? This is basically the nuts and bolts of today's lesson. Okay? So, I know a lot of you like good working definitions of key terms. And guess what? Here you go. So what is a good basic definition of industrial revolution? You see it in front of you. It's an increase in production. When we think of producing, we think about making things. Who produces something? Some kind of producer, whether it's a large scale company like Microsoft, or whether it's somebody like my wife who does artwork for her friends and basically sells it in a small piece by piece kind of thing. At the end of the day, guys, production is going to change. Why? Because we're using machines rather than the power of both humans or animals. Now, you might say, well, Mr. Baker, okay, does that mean that humans no longer matter? Of course not. All right, you're going to have farmers. You're going to have people that are obviously operating, we'll look at this more in the next slide, guys, mechanical reapers. You know, perhaps they still push them, or obviously your animals, right? Oxen, et cetera, are going to be doing that. But at the end of the day, what do we notice? Machines are going to enhance production. There's 4 things that in today's lesson, guys, that you want to be able to talk about, list, describe, explain, in their connection to why we have this industrial revolution. First of all, new inventions. People are making things. Okay? People are obviously doing a lot of things that involve inventions and innovations, building upon things that are from the past as we move forward. Transportation and communication. Okay? Think about the most primitive thing for a lot of us, roads. Okay? Guys, you got to remember, those of you that travel on Highway 40, 95, 77, the list goes on and on if you're watching this video from other parts of the country. Okay? Guys, you got to remember, those roads are not there before previous roads and the vision to have them starts us off in some direction. Okay? And communication. Why do we have it to where you could get something that's sent from a family member, let's say on the West Coast and parts of California, and most likely 3 to 4 days later, you're eventually going to get it in Raleigh, North Carolina, or somewhere like that? And the answer is efficiency and speed with how goods are basically brought from place to place. Okay? Guys, I realize we're thinking about this in a very 2020-ish perspective, but you got to go back and understand where a lot of this starts or continues. Market-based economic system. We're talking about selling goods in places. When you think of the word market, we think of a place where we go to buy and sell goods. All right? A lot of you enter a market anytime you pump gas in your car. Anytime, those of you that are teenagers that your parents say, hey, can you go and get me a thing of milk? You have decisions to make. Are you going to go to the Walmart? You're going to go to Target. You're going to go to somewhere like Harris Teeter, Publix, Food Lion, wherever. The market-based economic system is becoming a larger fixture. And that means, as we'll look at more, guys, in our next presentation, that we as people are more dependent on being consumers. Therefore, places that we go to buy things give us economic choices. And then fourthly, the development of banking. Now, a lot of you are like, well, I think of banks, I think of places to hold money. Okay, that's true. Okay, But the idea of banks provide a lot of opportunities. Most of you, I don't know if any of you guys out there are, I'm going to become a small business owner or whatever. A lot of students, I have a student of mine that started a lawn care business about 3 or 4 years ago. He is now operating that with precision, doing a great job. I remember talking to him and I was like, hey, so-and-so, what did it take? And he's like, a loan through our local bank for probably a few $1,000s. Okay. I had a teacher in middle school whose husband did the same thing, starting a Frisch's Big Boy restaurant. You see a good number of those in parts of Ohio where I grew up. And he was like, you know, I had this vision. I didn't have the money to start it. I needed it. This bank was helpful, or this lending institution. Okay. So something for us to keep in mind, all 4 of those elements. If you need to pause your screen to write those down before we move forward, guys, with the next few slides, I would highly encourage you to do that. Otherwise, let's take a look at inventions first. Okay. So this is not the whole gamut of inventors or inventions. Okay. But the names and giving them credit with what they're well known for are very important, but I would argue the effects are also as equally as important. In other words, explain how they're going to impact the economy moving forward. Now, some of you guys, if you pause this, you might want to look at them with a little bit of your time, but you'll notice, you're like, well, Mr. Baker, some of these are more linked to agriculture. That is definitely true. The cotton gin with Eli Whitney, John Deere steel plow. I know a lot of you guys, you go to Lowe's, you go to Home Depot, and you're like, oh my goodness, John Deere tractors, for good reason. That is not his original claim to fame. His original claim to fame is the good old-fashioned steel plow, which of course we know still exists, but it's going to develop over time. We'll come back to that in a second. And then Cyrus Cormick's mechanical reaper. That's going to allow us to basically harvest things like corn and grain a lot more efficiently, a lot faster. Because of that, what are we going to notice? Farmers are able to actually produce more. Now that has mixed blessings to it, okay? Because the downside is, guys, if you're overproducing, and let's say your market says, well, people are only going to buy a certain amount of your good, what's going to happen when supply is up here and demand is down here? And the answer is prices on goods are going to go down. Now, this is not an economic lesson, all right? But the idea of demand and supply, when you have more of a market-based economy, that is partly something that is usually going to dictate things like price, okay? So you want to keep that in mind. Now, you might be thinking, well, Mr. Baker, these other things. Samuel Morse's telegraph. You've all heard of the Morse code probably. The Steamboat by Robert Fulton. Elias Howe's sewing machine. Those don't look like they're going to have as big of an effect on farm production. And you're correct. So what would the telegraph do? Again, it's going to allow you to communicate over longer distances, faster, more efficiently. Okay, guys, think about this. I realize that we're kind of moving a little bit forward, but just to get you thinking about future lessons, imagine what Abraham Lincoln is going to be able to do with having the telegraph to communicate with his generals and other people during the Civil War. A lot of you today might be like, Mr. Baker, 2020, the president has the opportunity to do that through video calls, you know, FaceTime or whatever, okay, which is true. But again, something has to happen, guys, in order for us to move forward, okay? The steamboat, we'll see this more in a moment. It'll make more sense. Robert Fulton is going to be like, okay, this is going to allow us to go up current. It's going to allow us to be able to obviously navigate rivers easier. Ergo, think about from our last lesson, guys, or one of our last lessons, excuse me, the importance of controlling rivers like the Mississippi River, okay? It's going to allow us to enhance our trade, okay? Why is that a big deal? It used to take months, literally months, to get from, let's say, a place like Southern Ohio all the way around to, of course, parts of New England, Boston, etc. A lot of that goes back to technology, and internal improvements. Now, I want you to think really importantly, guys, about the cotton gin. This is probably the most influential invention that you'll hear about regarding the American South. Why? It's going to be seen as the king cotton product. Guys, cotton was, to a large extent, a driving force. Now, I realize some of you might be like, well, Mr. Baker, I live in North Carolina, therefore I know that tobacco is and was important too. There's no question that when you're looking at the settlement of places like Virginia, North Carolina, even Maryland, that of course tobacco is going to be important really in the early colonial days, and it still is. But when you have this cotton gin, it's going to be able to do a lot more with cotton production. There is a downside to this. And the downside is that slavery is going to continue to grow as a labor system in many parts of the American South, especially in parts of your deep South. Okay, meaning places like South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, even Eastern Texas, and of course, Louisiana. Okay, there's a theory out there that had this invention not occurred, we don't know for sure if this would have been completely true, that you would have had obviously perhaps a dying out of slavery. Many of your northern states had already started the process of emancipation laws. All right. And you got to remember they weren't as dependent on the kind of large scale farming that was cash crop based, but that is something to keep in mind. So what happens to basically lead to this first industrial revolution further? Well, the one thing, guys, you need to get down is that we're going to see an explosion, not literally, but figuratively, guys, in regards to textile production. What comes to mind when you think of textiles? Clothing. Things that involve taking cotton, okay, and other things like that, and producing things like shirts, pants, shoes, okay? Now, you might be wondering, well, Mr. Baker, you have a point here about the age of industry brought from England, okay? This is a picture of Samuel Slater. He's not American. He does make his way across the pond to the United States. Guys, you really cannot talk effectively about textiles in this revolution, at least in my mind, without also giving a lot of credit to Samuel Slater, because a lot of these ideas, you know, whether they're, you know, technology ideas or how to produce something, whatever it might be, are going to be heavily influenced by people like Samuel Slater. Okay. And so you don't have to worry about memorizing every single one of those inventions, but just keep in mind, if you're going to be basically putting a textile factory, if you will, all right, I'll show you a map here in a second that illustrates that further. What are you going to notice about a lot of these textile mills? A lot of them are going to be located in northern states, especially places like Massachusetts and also New York. Massachusetts, guys, if you take a look here, you'll notice one of the more common pictures of a textile factory. What do we notice? We notice many of them beside rivers. You got to remember, electricity is not easily sustained as efficiently as it is now. We have a lot more sources of electricity that we're using, nuclear power in some cases. Back then, you know, we don't really have that. Okay, so the idea of water power, okay, is going to become extremely important. And so what are you going to do? You're going to have all these different inventions that have a connection to things like water, steam power. You're going to have the development, of course, of what they call, you know, these textile factories that many women work in, all right, and eventually many immigrant women. Okay, I'll tell you a cool story about that when we get to the second industrial revolution. Okay, and then of course the argument is that you're not really going to have the cotton that you need, at least in the abundance that the North is going to have it with trade with the South, unless you of course have, again, that cotton gin. The positive is that it opens up a larger market for textiles. Did you all catch the negative on the previous slide? Yeah, that further development of the slave culture, or what some people would even call slavery as the quote unquote peculiar institution, okay, that basically supports the idea of producing more cotton. Okay, guys, by the time Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860, I realize, like Mr. Baker, you're giving us facts down the line, but just to show you how big of a deal this is, the American South is producing, I want to say it's about 4/5, 80%, I believe the last estimate I looked at, guys, was with American cotton, or sorry, with cotton in the world. All right, so it's not a big surprise why these two industries are heavily connected. And a lot of you are like, okay, Mr. Baker, let's take a little bit of a break. What does this image tell us about the textile boom that we're going to see in New England? We'll come back to this in our next session. For those of you that like minor league baseball, as you can see behind me, I actually collect minor league baseball hats. This is actually the mascot of the Lowell, Massachusetts team, and they're called the Lowell Spinners. If you ever go up to Lowell, it's about 90 minutes, I would say, north of Boston, all right, give or take, depending on traffic, etc. You'll notice that they have a museum there. You can go in it. You can see the way the cloth is made. One thing that I learned, guys, going there about 9 or 10 years ago is, first of all, just how loud these factories are. And you got to remember, this was just kind of a demonstration. This was not a full force kind of factory system that you would have seen back in the early to mid 1800s. But this is kind of cool, right, guys? You see, those of you that are sports fans or even not, you see a lot of history that kind of shapes the way that a lot of these places develop. And a lot of this goes back to economic and also social history. Okay? And so let's take a look really quick, and this will be the last segment of our lesson. And you can even, pause, guys, if you want to turn off hit your pause button or whatever. But we want to think between now and also the next session, guys, and also beyond then, how does things like economic development and also internal improvements impact sectional development between the North and the South, in other words, different regions, okay? And what effect is this going to have on the development of a national economy, okay? These two definitions you definitely want to get down, understand, and apply, okay? So sectionalism is not something that's new. Washington, guys, talked about it very in depth to an extent in his farewell address. So look at what this is: devotion to the interests of a region. These interests can be political, social, cultural, or in this case, economic. Okay, we already said to a large extent the South is going to be defined by agriculture, but not just agriculture in the sense of producing corn and wheat and things like that. You're going to see that a bit more in the middle and also the Midwestern or Old Northwest places. But what do we notice, guys? Cash crops, like especially cotton. I know a lot of you are like, Mr. Baker, we're tired of hearing that. Guys, it is a very important thing, okay? And the way that the governments go about investing in all these things that have these effects is going to get people's attention and also agreement and or disagreement, okay? And so how does the internal improvement play into this? Well, guys, the internal improvement are things like public works, okay? So think about the things that governments do to actually try to improve their states and even the federal or national scene with connecting different states and different regions, okay? But these are things that are mostly, at least what we're going to look at today and part of the next session, guys, for transportation infrastructure. Now, infrastructure is a very broad concept. I mean, technically, you could say, do we have enough schools to expand? Okay. Well, you might say, well, heck, do we have enough roads to actually go and connect different places to where cars are not bottlenecked and we have really a lot of problems with moving from place to place? Okay. So what's going to be the big things that we see with developing these internal improvements? And roads are big, right? The idea of building these roads, guys, remember, these roads take time to build, okay? Turnpikes. If you've ever traveled through West Virginia, you know that they're constantly wanting you to give to the turnpike, right? It's in fact required if you go within that 60, 70 mile period or whatever it was or is, excuse me, all right? And the turnpikes cost money. to maintain the roads, etc. It's also a form of revenue, keep in mind. Canals, you don't see that as much as you did back then, but keep in mind the canal is going to become a very effective way to connect rivers and waterways. And then also the idea of harbors. Think of cities, guys, that you maybe have visited that have harbors or the ability to bring in ships. Okay, Savannah, Georgia to an extent, Charleston, South Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina, places like Norfolk, Virginia, Baltimore, Maryland, of course, New York City, Boston, the list goes on and on. They're all going to be locations for major places that have become very important with trade. So my question, guys, to all of you is pause and think about what this image or this map here tells us about the development of infrastructure and internal improvements. Okay, what do we notice? We notice several important roads. The national road connecting from St. Louis to the west, from, as you can see here, about Baltimore, Maryland. All right, so that's a sizable venture. Now you might be like, well, Mr. Baker, man, that would be a far drive today. Imagine what that drive would have been like using buggies or horse-drawn carriages way back in the day. Okay, but it's more efficient, right? It's going to allow you to get from place to place more quickly and also faster. What's the one thing we notice with this road, the coastal road? Those of you that have traveled on Highway 95, this very closely resembles the road that you would take from all the way into southern Florida today. Florida, keep in mind, is going to eventually become an American state. It's not until the late teens and early 1820s. Okay, and so what do we notice? It goes all the way as far as Portland, Maine, and of course beyond there even now. Okay, what do these roads allow us to do? Well, you're going to remember we don't have semis, but we do have, again, horse-drawn carriages. What's going to be the one thing, guys, that should really stand out to you? You're right, the canals. The canals are going to basically become the most efficient form of transportation prior to the large-scale development of the American Railroad. Okay, and you can easily see that. Like the one that probably is the most well-known is going to be the Erie Canal. Okay, so you're going to notice this goes all the way from here over to the Great Lakes. That's going to open up opportunity to trade with parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, even, of course, if you take a look, guys, at connecting it eventually to parts of Indiana and then even parts of Illinois, you notice that becoming very important. Now, I want you to think, what do we not see in most of the southern states? That's right, large-scale development of these internal improvements. Okay, so Henry Clay, who, by the way, was from the great state of Kentucky, right, is going to be the architect, you could say, of this plan that we call the American system. And his argument is that we have to focus on a national economy, an economy that is going to basically benefit, if you will, guys, the whole nation in ways. And he was a lot like somebody like Alexander Hamilton. Okay, focus on internal improvements is a little bit of a gain, or shall we say a little bit more. Okay, but the idea, guys, of we need to have canals, we need to fund them with federal money, we need to obviously have a federal bank continuing, which will become an issue we'll look at under Jackson again. Okay, and so my question, guys, to all of you is, why would this be a sectional problem? If somebody like Henry Clay is going to say, well, let all the states pay federal taxes and the federal government is going to fund it. Why? Because it's a national program to help us out. You can see, guys, clearly most of your southern states are not going to be on board with federal funding. Why? You can see it. They're not heavily benefiting from those kinds of internal improvements. Okay. This is another example, guys, of the national road. All right. If you're kind of wondering, what do all these little stops indicate? Well, those would be stops that you would pay turnpikes. Now, back then, from what I've read, guys, not all of these roads are going to be paid for to build, in this case, guys, by completely public funds or taxes. So what happens if you have somebody as wealthy as somebody like, you know, eventually John D. Rockefeller or somebody like that that comes around later, and he is like, well, I'm going to build these roads and I want to be able to make money off them. That's going to be where you have an emphasis on the turnpikes. Okay. Now, the turnpikes that you see, like in parts of West Virginia, Florida, you know, Delaware has a lot of toll roads as well. There's just a few. Connecticut has a lot of northern states tend to have those. What do you notice, guys? You're paying to use those roads every few miles or whatever. Okay. So it's a way for these roads to stay, you know, shall we say, in good condition, to have road work done, etc. But you'll notice this national road does cover a pretty important distance. Okay. And so you might want to stop here, and this will be where we end before we talk about the rest of the week a little bit. So what are we noticing, guys? First of all, we do not see a lot of substantial, that's the key word here, railroad development that connects the entire nation until the 1830s and eventually the 1860s. Okay. Those of you who have heard the expression transcontinental railroad, all right, a railroad that basically connects both sides of the coast, east to west, etc. That does not get officially finalized until early May of 1869 in a place called Promontory Point, Utah. Okay. And we'll talk about that early part of next quarter. But as you can see here, guys, no question. Why is being able to, I'm going to go back to my previous slide, guys, with so you can see here. Why would it be, you know, a couple of weeks trip or whatever to go from an area here because of canals, river travel, and eventually the steamboats, and also be able to go from here to here, etc. Why would that affect things like the mail system? Okay. I know as a kid, every year, I had this lady, a good friend of our family, used to send me $1 in the mail, you know, $1 bill. And I used to think that was the coolest thing. And I think she was local, but imagine, you know, if she were living in California, and I grew up in a southern place of Ohio like that, Chillicothe, about an hour north of Portsmouth, okay, between Portsmouth and Columbus, you know, and I had to wait 3 months for that instead of just maybe 3 to 4 days. It's going to help, guys, with simple things like mail. It's also going to help with, if you're a farmer, let's say you farm something that has a low shelf life. You know, you're a dairy farmer, let's say over in parts of Michigan or even you know, somewhere eventually like Wisconsin, you know, the dairy farms that we see a lot, or even, guys, somewhere even in New York, right, that actually has a decent amount of those in rural areas. Okay. You're going to be able to get your stuff from place to place. It's going to open up additional customers, markets, and consumers. Very important. Okay. So what I want you to get from this slide is basically a couple of things. We're expanding trade opportunity because of connections from different parts of the country. And especially with canals, we're connecting the east to the west. Now, a lot of you are like, well, Mr. Baker, when I think of west, I think of like states like California, Arizona, Washington, Oregon. Okay, let's kind of forget that for the moment. If you look at your course packs, for those of you that are in my class, you'll notice the definition of the old Northwest. Guys, pretty much what we're talking about with the West. And remember, we don't even control, you know, the area of Texas yet. We're pretty much talking about places like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, what is not connected as much? The northern states, the western states to the southern states. Again, something to kind of connect. Okay. For the rest of the week, between now and your next day, you want to make sure, if you've not done so yet, guys, you're establishing a rapport with me through your getting to know you meetings. This gives me the opportunity to basically get to know you, what are your interests, but it also gives me an opportunity to see how has your transition to my class been, what can I do to not lower a bar, but also to kind of help you move in the direction of mastering, let's say, writing skills or studying or whatever it might be to kind of help you maximize your success. Okay, for standard, Your assignment for this week, that will be due by your day 1 day. So remember, if you're on Monday, that's Monday. If you're Tuesday, that's Tuesday. You have an assignment that you'll be using 2 documents. One is going to be a map that is of the internal improvements. The other one is going to be a primary source reading, and you're going to use the actual template, which is a series of questions, to basically answer using those 2 documents. Okay. Please check Canvas for that. It should be pretty clear, but if you have questions, I'll stay on to help you out with it. Okay. Honors, remember, you are working on your essay assignment. This is not a full-length essay, but you're basically developing context and a thesis. You're developing a plan on how you would write it. You're also developing at least one solid support paragraph that encompasses all of the different elements. If you have not watched the video from week 3 that covers how to develop context, how to develop a thesis, how to develop a plan to move forward with this essay, etc., it is strongly suggested that you do that, because that's going to give you some clear guidance. But you can make a decision on that, and certainly you can meet with me if you want to. I would like for you to try to have this done by the evening of your day 2. However, because this is a larger assignment and it's something that we're going to build upon a lot with our skills, if you feel like Friday's session or our office hours needs to really be attended by you to get help to submit it, as long as you can have that submitted by Friday at 2:30 p.m., then I'm fine with that. Now, keep in mind, you will still have your weekly review quiz, mastery quiz, excuse me, on Friday for the honor students. Okay. That is it. If you need to contact me, feel free to at bakerd@franklinacademy.org. Otherwise, that is part 1 of our first industrial revolution. Stay tuned next time for this transition further into sectional conflict and disagreement, and how the economies of the North and the South are going to be very differentiated from each other, and also the concept of what we call the market revolution. Thank you. Take care. As always, be safe. This is Baker's Backyard with another installment, and I appreciate your time. Thank you, and have a good one. Bye-bye.